Good evening, I'm Nadia Jani and you're watching A News. Let's see your headlines. The US and European Union avoid a trade war with a 15% tariff deal. Thailand and Cambodia have now agreed to an immediate and unconditional ceasefire, effective from midnight. And at least 3 people killed and several seriously injured after a train derailed in southern Germany. The United States and the European Union have struck a trade deal to avoid crippling tariffs. President Donald Trump and the President of the European Union announced the agreement on Sunday, which will see EU goods taxed at 15%. Nick Harper has more from Washington.
It's taken 4 months of intense negotiations, but going into this weekend there was a renewed sense of optimism that the US and the EU was close to achieving a deal. Donald Trump is in Scotland on a 4-day golfing and business trip, and on Sunday Ursula von der Leyen, the EU chief, visited him at one of his Scottish golf courses. Before their closed-door meeting, both leaders said there was a 50-50 chance of achieving a deal, but just over an hour later they came out to announce what they said was the largest trade deal ever achieved. Trade between the 27-member bloc and the United States last year totaled almost $2 trillion. Donald Trump achieved a 15% tariff rate for European goods entering the United States. He had threatened 30% if a deal was not done by his August 1st deadline. So it is a better rate than threatened, but it's certainly not the 0% rate that the Europeans were pushing for. There are some exceptions as well. Pharmaceuticals are not included in this deal. Neither is European steel and aluminium. Steel and aluminium will remain at a 50% rate. The EU also agreed to buy US military equipment, to buy $750 billion worth of US energy, and to make $600 billion of investments in the United States. Ursula von der Leyen said it had achieved a stability and predictability that was needed in the trading relationship between the two countries. But when asked what concessions the US had made, she dodged the question, instead saying that this had achieved rebalance when before there was imbalance. That August 1st deadline is fast approaching, with countries around the world looking to try and do deals with the United States. Donald Trump on Sunday said he's looking at deals with 3 or 4 other countries. Those could come in the coming days. Nick Harper for A News in Washington, D.C.
Following on from that, we're now joined by Ricardo Evangelista, CEO of Active Trades from Lisbon. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for having me.
No problem. Mr. Evangelista, my first question is, Trump called it a breakthrough, but with major sectors still left out, would you say that the deal is close to being finalised, or could we still see a major shift?
Well, it looks like there are still many details missing from what has so far been shared. For example, steel and aluminium, pharmaceuticals. Both of these are quite important for the European Union in terms of what they represent in terms of exports to the US. So still quite a lot to be defined and revealed. It's almost like what we've had presented to us as a trade deal is more a framework. So it establishes the baseline tariff rate, which will be 15%, but then there will be finer detail that is yet to be revealed. So instead of calling this a trade deal, I would call it a framework with a view to then negotiate a more detailed trade deal.
Okay, and with now Europe committing to hundreds of billions to US energy and investment, who stands to gain the most from this deal? Who is actually better off or worse off, would you say?
I would say that it is difficult to see this deal as anything else than anything other than a victory for Donald Trump. So Donald Trump, abrasive, erratic style of negotiating, I think really got something big here. And for the European Union, this is, if not a defeat, it is at least disappointing, because the role of the European Commission is to negotiate on behalf of the member states, and the sheer size of the European market and the wealth of the European market dictates that the European Union would have started these negotiations at least on a similar position to that of the US. And despite so far the European Union having had for decades now a positive trade balance with the US. Nevertheless, I think the European Commission didn't really leverage on this strength that I just described, and instead capitulated to the American demands, and in fact doesn't seem to have, at least so far from what we know, doesn't seem to have obtained any concessions or any improvements from its counterpart in Washington. And on the other hand, the average tariff that was paid by EU goods entering the US, which was around 5%, will now be much higher. So I would say that this is definitely a victory for the US, a victory personally for Donald Trump, whose unorthodox style and approach to negotiating finally achieved this big breakthrough here with this deal with the European Union.
And very quickly, do you think that this tariff strategy that the US is now implementing across the globe is working? Is it outweighing the benefits now?
Well, it depends how you look at it. I mean, if you look from the US perspective, I would say that it's definitely working. I mean, we've had a deal last week with Japan, an important deal. We also have the perspective now of a deal with the UK and other countries as well. This one with the EU is definitely massive. So from the US perspective, it's definitely working. The threat of triggering a global trade war where there would be no winners means that so far the American counterparts in these negotiations have, if I may say so, chickened out. We're still waiting to see what happens with the negotiations with China, but so far the US stance in regards to this matter of global trade, it's definitely paying dividends. They are definitely the winners so far, and I would say that after what's been revealed this weekend, the EU is definitely the biggest loser so far.
Thank you, Ricardo, Evangelista. Thank you for joining us this evening.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer has arrived at the Turnberry for high-level talks with US President Donald Trump. Trade and the Gaza conflict are on the agenda, with other Scottish leaders also making their voices heard. President Trump welcomed Prime Minister Keir Starmer to his Turnberry resort for talks on trade and Gaza. They'll continue their discussions in Aberdeen. Scotland's First Minister John Sweeney will join them for dinner, pushing for the removal of tariffs on Scotch whisky. And while trade remains a top story, attention has also turned to Scotland, where President Trump is hosting UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer for talks. Our Washington correspondent, Obey Shabanda, joins us now in the studio. Hello this evening, how are you?
Good.
Great. So my first question now is, President Trump is hosting the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer on UK soil, but how is that being viewed in Washington?
Anytime you have the American Stars and Stripes meeting the Union Jack in the Green Highlands of Scotland is certainly going to make major international headlines. And now just to sort of show our viewers, it may be a little confusing to explain the context here. Yes, President Trump is hosting the United Kingdom's Prime Minister in Scotland because that's where President Trump has some of his two biggest golf courses, one in Aberdeenshire and the other one in Turnberry. So it's an interesting juxtaposition here. But there's still discussions between the United Kingdom and the United States when it comes to trade between the two countries. Now, they did back in May agree to a trade deal where the US puts a 10% tariff on imported UK goods, which is certainly less than the 15% tariffs that have been put on European Union goods following that negotiated deal on Sunday. But when it comes to Great Britain's exports of steel and aluminum, there are still more discussions to be had, and those discussions, those negotiations will continue between President Trump and Prime Minister Starmer in Aberdeen. Of course, all this comes just before the 11th hour, the deadline of August 1st, which is right in front of us. And one of the big headlines that were made in that meeting between President Trump and Prime Minister Starmer is that the president said that he is now changing the deadline that he gave President Putin of Russia from 50 days to 10 days to come up with a deal that the U.S. wants to negotiate between the Kremlin and Kyiv. Of course, as that war continues, the president had just a number of wars. He said that he was disappointed with President Putin, and he told the press in Turnberry that Russian men and Ukrainian soldiers are dying for no reason. Those were the words of President Trump. And of course, all this coming following that major deal between the United States and the European Union. For the longest time, President Trump had said that the American consumers were being ripped off by European Union value-added tax and what the president viewed as major impediments to American exports to the European market. But so you can certainly expect more headlines to be made as the talks between the American president and the prime minister continues, with Ukraine and Gaza being at the forefront, and that deadline, now 10 days. How will Moscow react?
And just on that, actually, now that obviously you're saying that Trump is hosting, obviously, Keir Starmer in his back garden, so to speak, how important is that relationship? Is this unorthodox, or is this something that you can see a relationship more and more forming between the UK Prime Minister and Donald Trump?
Well, this is the special relationship. The U.S. only has one special relationship, and that is with the United Kingdom. No other bilateral relationship between Washington is referred to in those terms. And of course, that is because of the long time diplomatic and strategic and military cooperation on a variety of fields between Washington and London. And Prime Minister Starmer, even though he's from the Labour Party, the left of center, has made an exceptional effort on reaching out to President Trump on a person-to-person level, texting him or WhatsApping him on a regular basis and praising his leadership. So London certainly very much aware that the United States, being one of the largest economy on earth with a massive market, 400 million people, a market that British exports really depend upon, that Keir Starmer is really ensuring that he is on the right side of President Trump, and he got a lower tariff than the European Union as a result.
Thank you, Obe. European stocks rise to a 4-month high after the US and EU strike a trade agreement deal. The EU-US trade agreement, reached just before the 1st of August deadline, sets a 15% tariff on most of EU goods and includes a $600 billion EU investment in the US, while tariffs on spirits remain under negotiation. Auto stocks rose sharply. Porsche, Mercedes-Benz, Stellantis and Volvo cars all advanced between 1.6% and 3%. Pharmaceutical shares also strengthened, with Novo Nordisk and Roche each climbing more than 1.5%. Top US and Chinese officials will resume talks in Stockholm today to try and tackle long-standing economic disputes at the centre of a trade war between the world's top two economies. The talks intend to build on earlier agreements made in Geneva and London, which temporarily capped reciprocal tariffs at roughly 30 to 55% on US imports and around 10% on Chinese goods. If no deal is reached by the 12th of August, tariffs could surge back to triple-digit levels, disrupting global supply chains. Our reporter Laura Westbrook has more on the trade talks in China.
US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who's leading the US delegation, has set a pretty low baseline expectation that the two sides would likely extend their trade truce, which currently expires on August 12th, for reportedly another 90 days. It's his third meeting with Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng, who is leading the Chinese delegation, and these talks are also expected to lay the groundwork for a possible leaders' meeting between President Donald Trump and President Xi Jinping on the sidelines of the APEC summit in October in South Korea. Now, since the last round of talks, Beijing has boosted shipments of rare earth magnets used to make everything from electric vehicles to high-tech weapons, while the US has relaxed restrictions on sales of less advanced semiconductors to China. These talks are supposed to be much more wide-ranging. Scott Bessent has said that Chinese purchases of oil from Russia and Iran could be on the table, but getting China to agree to cut its oil imports would likely be very disruptive for the Chinese economy. And Chinese state media has already pushed back against that idea. One state-run outlet reported that China won't play along with such attempts to use Beijing to hurt Russia's economy. And this comes against the backdrop of Chinese purchases of US crude oil, liquefied natural gas and coal reportedly dropping to zero last month. China has imposed 10 to 15% tariffs on US energy goods in retaliation to fentanyl-related tariffs. State-run outlet The Global Times reported that a key focus of this round of talks is to build on agreements reached in previous talks and to push for more tangible results. A top priority for Beijing is getting a reduction to the 20% fentanyl-related tariffs. China has made some efforts, adding 2 more chemicals that can be used to make fentanyl into the restricted list, a move that Donald Trump has praised. Laura Westbrook, A News, Hong Kong.
At least 6 people were killed when a gunman opened fire at a market in Bangkok on Monday, according to local police. The victims include the gunman who took his own life, according to the Deputy Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police Bureau, Charan Gupta. One person was found alive but later died despite rescue efforts. Police say the 5 other victims were security guards at the market. Authorities are still investigating the gunman's identity and possible motive. Thailand and Cambodia have now agreed to an immediate and unconditional ceasefire, effective midnight tonight, following emergency talks hosted in Kuala Lumpur by Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim. Acting Prime Minister of Thailand and Cambodian Prime Minister have participated in the mediation, which received backing from key international players, including ASEAN, the US and China. Both leaders agreed to halt hostilities and resume direct communications, despite ongoing shelling and claims of ceasefire violations earlier in the day. Both sides signed onto the ceasefire initiative, emphasizing the urgency to restore peace along the disputed border. The roots of Thailand-Cambodia conflict run deep, tied to colonial era, borders, temple ownership and decades of disputed territory. As the two sides now agree to a fragile ceasefire, we take a closer look at the long-standing tensions fueling the crisis.
The conflict's roots go back to colonial-era borders drawn by French authorities in 1907. At that time, Thailand, then Siam, was pressured by France to sign a treaty that included a map placing the ancient Preah Vihear temple inside Cambodian territory. Cambodia views this map as legally binding and has used it to support its claims. Thailand disputes the map's accuracy and the treaty's validity, saying it was signed under pressure and never fully approved. Tensions rose sharply in 2008 after Cambodia listed the temple as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. This triggered strong nationalist backlash in Thailand. That year, Thai soldiers reportedly moved near a disputed pagoda close to the temple. Cambodia claims this land, but Thailand says the border there was never fully marked. The dispute stems from a 1962 International Court of Justice ruling. The court awarded ownership of the temple to Cambodia by a 9-3 vote. Since then, clashes have happened sporadically, causing casualties on both sides. The latest escalation began in May, after a Cambodian soldier was killed during a border skirmish. Both countries have since imposed trade bans, withdrawn ambassadors, and reinforced their military presence.
Yemen's Houthi forces are threatening to target ships belonging to companies that do business with Israeli ports, regardless of their nationalities. The Houthi military spokesperson warned companies to stop business or face attacks from Houthi missiles and drones. He urged countries to pressure Israel to end its siege on Gaza, promising the Houthis would stop attacks once the siege is lifted. Israel's military said it will open humanitarian corridors to allow aid convoys into the Gaza Strip after weeks of mounting international pressure and warnings of starvation. The military also announced it would pause operations each day for 10 hours in parts of Gaza.
Israel, under intense global scrutiny, has resumed airdrops of food supplies. Military footage released on Saturday shows aid boxes parachuting into northern Gaza with flour, sugar and canned goods provided by international agencies. After months of international pressure, aid trucks are finally on the move toward Gaza. Egyptian state media aired footage on Sunday showing convoys of humanitarian trucks departing from the Rafah border crossing. Dozens of vehicles carrying tons of aid are heading to the Karem Shalom crossing, one of the main access points into southern Gaza. Inside Gaza, humanitarian organizations warn the crisis is beyond urgent. The World Health Organization says starvation is now widespread across the territory, home to over 2 million people. Israel has announced on Sunday tactical pauses in military activity for humanitarian purposes from 10 a.m. to 8 p.m., though many question how safe or effective these windows really are. Thousands of Israelis took to the streets of Tel Aviv on Saturday, voicing their strong opposition to the country's continued military operations in the Gaza Strip and calling for an early ceasefire agreement with Hamas.
We think that there is no point in continuing the war, and everything should be with a solution for both sides. So we just hope that someone will make sure that it happens as soon as possible.
With no end in sight to the conflict, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza continues, and despite fresh aid deliveries, the threat of widespread famine remains.
Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu claims there is no starvation in Gaza, despite growing global concern. His remarks come as Israel pledges to open new aid corridors and pause military operations for 10 hours a day. Netanyahu added that Israel will continue to fight until they have achieved a complete victory over Hamas.
Israel is presented as though we are applying a campaign of starvation in Gaza. What a bold-faced lie. There is no policy of starvation in Gaza, and there is no starvation in Gaza. We enable humanitarian aid throughout the duration of the war to enter Gaza, otherwise there would be no Gazans. And what has interdicted the supply of humanitarian aid is one force, Hamas. Again, the reversal of truth. Hamas robs, steals this humanitarian aid, and then accuses Israel of not supplying it.
At least 3 people have died and several seriously injured after a train derailed in southwestern Germany. The accident happened on a route near French and Swiss borders, with emergency crews working through the night.
Around 100 people were on board this train when 2 of its 4 carriages left the tracks, killing 3 people and seriously wounding many others. The accident happened on Sunday early evening near the German border with France and Switzerland. It was travelling between the towns of Sigmaringen and Ulm, a route of roughly 90 kilometres.
At around 6:10 p.m, we received a report that a regional express train had derailed on the route between Sigmaringen and Ulm. It has been verified that this occurred between Riedlingen and Munderkingen. 2 carriages jumped the tracks and derailed. As things stand, there are 3 fatalities and several injuries.
The derailment prompted a large-scale emergency response, with 120 rescue workers initially called to the scene. The fire chief for the district described the wreckage as severely twisted.
The train is still exactly as the emergency services found it, a train with 4 carriages that left the track bed and was pushed together and pulled apart accordingly.
National rail operator Deutsche Bahn said its thoughts were with the victims and their loved ones. It said many people had been injured and that it was working closely with authorities to determine what caused the crash. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz posted on X to say he mourned the victims and offered his deepest sympathy to their families. The cause of the derailment remains under investigation.
Wildfires continue to rage in the Turkish northwestern Bursa province. Thousands of people have evacuated from several neighborhoods as air and ground crews battle the flames. High temperatures and winds have fueled the spread of fire. More than 1,700 people have been evacuated as a precaution. Around 1,000 firefighters are working on containing the blaze with air support. Turkey is facing a severe wildfire crisis amid soaring temperatures, with authorities working around the clock to contain the flames. Joining me now is Burkar Ilhan from Turkey Research Foundation to shed some light on the situation and challenges ahead. Good evening, Mr. Ilhan.
Good evening, and thanks for having me.
No problem. My first question is, how effective have the emergency responses been so far in containing these wildfires?
Yeah, unfortunately, there are multiple wildfires across the nation right now, and I would say that there are 4 cities are of importance. These cities are Bursa, Kahramanmaraş, Karabük, and Izmir. And so far, I think that the situation is largely under control, and the Turkish authorities are closely monitoring the situation right now. And also, there are thousands of firefighters and first responders are on the ground right now, and they are trying to combat the fires both from the ground and from the air. And looking at the overall picture, I would say that in the fires in Izmir and in Karabük are largely under the control, and right now Bursa is a critical city, and I think that in a couple of days the fires in Bursa will be contained. And I think right now, fortunately, we have also some casualties. This is also a sad news, but overall, in the overall picture, I think in the short terms, the fires will be under control.
And how is climate change impacting the frequency and intensity of wildfires? And what do you think are the long-term measures that can be considered around this?
Yes, for sure. Climate change or weather conditions are important factors causing wildfires or forest fires. But statistically speaking, especially in the case of Turkey, I would say that the vast majority of wildfires are caused by human activity, not by the natural activities. And I think it's just around 90%. It's from human activity. And I would say that it's in a way, it's a good news, because if it's about people, then we can educate people, we can increase public awareness about it. But I think it's a generational effort. As you said, we need also preventive measures and proactive measures. And right now, I would say that looking at the Turkish emergency response plans, Turkey have solid plans about it. But I think in the midterm and in the short term, Turkey will need to update its wildfire management plans, because in recent years we are witnessing lots of wildfires right now, and this has become a major issue in recent years. And I think in the short term, Turkey will need a preventive strategy combating wildfires. Like we need early detection systems. Also Turkey has a very good in a very good position in drones and early detection systems. I think we could use such systems, such early detection systems like drones, like sensors, and also even artificial intelligence. You can just closely monitor high-risk areas, and you can predict the areas that could fire break out. And I think in the short term and in the long term, and Turkey will need to update its fire management plans, I would say.
Thank you for joining me today, Mr. Ilhan. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Google says it's failed to warn more than 10 million people in Turkey about a deadly earthquake in 2023, which killed at least 55,000 people. The tech giant's researchers reported in the Science Journal that its earthquake alert system's warnings were delivered to only 469 people. More than 100,000 people were injured when the quake struck the region in the early hours in February 2 years ago. Google has since updated the detection algorithms, but stresses its alerts are meant to support, not replace, national systems. A senior advisor to Iran's supreme leader called the Zangazo corridor project a cover to broader projects aiming to undermine Iran's national security. He said the objective of the corridor is to sever Iran's link with the Caucasus and impose a land blockade on Iran and Russia. He added that Iran has opposed such actions from the outset, even deploying forces to the borders and conducting deterrent exercises. Georgia has reported a sharp increase in shipments passing through its territory along the Middle Corridor. That's the route connecting China and Europe through Central Asia and the South Caucasus. According to the country's economy ministry, in the first 6 months of this year, nearly 10,000 shipping containers were transported along the corridor, which is more than a 170% increase compared to the same period last year. The Baku-Tbilisi-Kars railway also saw a major boost, carrying more than 9,300 containers, up from just 160 last year. That's all we have for now. Thank you for watching and stay tuned to A News.